I'm now delighted to welcome up onto stage Gianna M. Eckhart, Professor of Marketing, King's College London. She's going to be in conversation with Ella Sagar, our reporter from the Media Leader. This is social status is rapidly changing and it will impact your brand, so please welcome them to stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to this session. I'm very honoured to be in conversation with Professor Gianna Eckhart today, a Professor of Marketing from King's College London. She's going to be talking about her insights from her paper, New Dynamics of Social Status and Distinction. What does that mean, you might ask? And we're going to dive straight into that. So first off, Gianna, could you tell me a bit about what do you mean by social status and distinction?
Thanks, Ella, for having me. So social status and distinction is something that humans have always striven for and exhibited through symbols and material culture all throughout time. So whether it was, tribes where people, who had the biggest feather or feathers of a particular color, up until we can think, more recently of, people who displayed their wealth via having castles or large estates and things like this. So social status and distinction is simply a way of displaying one's place in a hierarchy. And the term that I like to use to think about, in particular times closer to now, is that solid modernity has been something that has been around up until about 20 years ago. So what that meant was that what was able to display social status and distinction were very solid assets, like the houses that I just mentioned, would be one, or different, cars or things that really cost a lot and that you would have for long periods of time were typically what would display this.
So the mansions and the Ferraris,
exactly.
Those sorts of things. And so what was the role of brands, I've just mentioned one, in conferring social status and distinction in the past, and then how is that changing now?
Yeah, so in order for brands, in order for them to be able to do this effectively, it was all about conspicuousness. So their brands needed to be able to send really clear signals to other people. So the classic example of this is always, carrying the LV handbag, which has the huge LV on it, so everyone can see exactly what it is. You can go home and look up how much it costs, and so the nature of the signal that was sending was fairly clear. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Torsten Veblen and his theory of conspicuous consumption, which he wrote around the turn of the century, and I mean the turn of the last century, so 1899, not 20 years ago. And this was exactly the theory that's underpinned a lot of our understanding of consumption and branding ever since then, that if it's not conspicuous and if it can't send a clear signal, then brands aren't doing their job. But more recently, this has not necessarily been the case, and it's because the ability of brands to send a clear signal is no longer the same. So think about, if we take the LV handbag example, think about counterfeits. Somebody could have paid $20 for their LV handbag. So the signal of what that is saying is not as easy to interpret. But you can also think about platforms like Bag, Borrow, or Steal, which has been around for more than a decade now, which operates on what used to be a Netflix model. If you remember when Netflix would send you the DVDs in the mail, and after you watched one, you'd send it back. That's how the Bag, Borrow, or Steal operates. So you can have a Prada handbag one week, a Gucci the next week, and LV the week after. And so and this is all for a monthly membership fee. So again, it's just another example of how the ability for these brands to send clear signals is no longer the same as they used to be.
Yeah, and some of those signals are like aspirational kind of signals, and it's a costly signal, I guess. Is one way of putting it. And exactly. What are going to be, you've mentioned handbags, but what are going to be the new status symbols now, do you think?
Yeah, so that's a great question. One of the things that my research has shown over the past few years is that what is now kind of conveying more status is more about the means of production of something. So what I mean by that is how something is made, and does it embody craftsmanship and authenticity. These are things that consumers are looking for now and that tend to convey more status. So one of my favorite examples of this is what is typically referred to as a new luxury brand, Shinola. And for those of you who may know Shinola, they are based in Detroit, and they started out with a social mission, which was to make sure that the different artisanship and craftsmanship that exists in Detroit from when that was a hub of car making didn't die out, and to try and revitalize the city. And what consumers kind of want to buy into with this is exactly those values. And so how it's produced using these kind of handmade artisanship, craftsmanship, that's where the value comes from. So that this is one way, the shift towards means of production. Other ways is also signals that can't necessarily be copied. So one of my favorite examples of this is something like a heritage tomato. If you go to a farmer's market and you buy one of those tomatoes that looks quite different, to the kind that you see in the supermarket, but just kind of what that displays, if you serve that to someone, if they come over to your house to have a salad with you, or come over to eat at your house, is that you have the knowledge to understand the importance of why it's important to have a large variety of tomatoes and not just a couple varieties in terms of the implications for the earth, but also that they might taste different. And so what's being displayed here is knowledge, and it's a signal that can't easily be copied in the way that something can be counterfeited, for example. So heritage tomatoes always cost more than the regular ones at the supermarket, right? So it still has that dimension to it, but it's exhibiting knowledge rather than just a conspicuous display of a brand.
So it has to be unique, and it has to have, some kind of ethical element to it in the means of production. And there has to be like, I know a lot about this area because I've bought this. That's the sort of thing you're talking about.
Yes.
Yeah. I think you were talking a bit about ownership and maybe like borrowing as opposed to, owning it outright. Is ownership still relevant as a status symbol? Do people still need to buy houses and things like that and permanently own something?
Yeah, so this has been one of the biggest shifts when we think about how social status and distinction is displayed, is the decreasing importance of ownership. And this is being facilitated so much by the different sharing economy platforms as well. So I mentioned Bag, Borrow, or Steal, which is one of the older ones along with Rent the Runway. But we can think about a lot of new platforms. So in the realm of fashion, we can think about Her or Buy Rotation, which are getting huge amounts of investment at the moment. And it's ways to kind of access fashion, and then you send it back at the end of the week or the weekend, and then you can get a new outfit for the next week. Very famously, when the G7 was hosted earlier this year, Boris Johnson's wife, Carrie, everything that she owned was rented through one of these platforms, and this was very much talked about on the global stage. When we think about living, so we mentioned, you mentioned this example of housed mansions and things like this. What is now conveys status in that realm is places like the Collective or Gravity Co-Living. If you don't know these are the Collective and Gravity are the two main ones in the world. They have locations in London and New York, and then some other global capitals as well. But you pay a membership fee, and you can live there depending on for however long you want. So if you have work in New York for a few months and then in London for a few months, they do your laundry for you, and everything is included in living. But they also have all sorts of activities and lectures that you can join to engage in self-improvement that happen within the building itself. And this notion of spending your time and your money on self-improvement is also something that very clearly is a status indicator now.
So self-improvement, what kind of things, is that a kind of a mindfulness, meditation sort of thing? Is it like Duolingo and learning a new language, that kind of thing?
Yes, so those are great examples of exactly things that would be offered at the Collective, for example. But typically, it usually goes beyond that too, of how to maximize your success as an entrepreneur and into work areas as well as personal areas too.
Yeah, got it. And so, what are the implications for brands and advertising? Because obviously, we're in the business of selling people products or services, and so what's the future there?
Yeah, so I think, so we can see a lot of, I guess what you'd call traditional companies trying to move into this space and take advantage of what's going on. So Mercedes, for example, you can now rent Mercedes directly from them, not through a car rental service like Zipcar, but directly from Mercedes now. Urban Outfitters and types of retailers like this now, because of these platforms like Buy Rotation, they're now trying to compete with them, and so you can rent clothes through, directly through retailers themselves. So that's one way. But I think some other ways, analog is becoming a status symbol, like listening to music on vinyl records, taking photos using film rather than digital. These types of things which consumers, it has more meaning to consumers in this way, but also facilitates creativity. So when Kodak came out of bankruptcy in 2014, for example, and started selling their film again, the whole marketing premise behind it was, we can facilitate you being creative in ways that taking digital photos cannot. So these are some ways that I think brands are starting to move in these directions.
So there is like a sustainable element there. There's this kind of sentimental element if you want that kind of permanence of that memory, if you're using Kodak as an example. Are there any other examples of best practice in this space?
Yeah, so one of my favorite examples is a luxury brand called Shangja. For those of you who don't know it, it's a Chinese luxury brand. It was started as a joint venture with Hermes, although Hermes is no longer a part of it. But it was founded specifically on the principles of making sure that that different forms of traditional Chinese artisanship did not die out. So they do have clothes, but they have a lot of furniture. They have a lot of porcelain, so tea sets and things like this. It is extraordinarily expensive to buy anything from Shangja, but it's very inconspicuous. They would never have their brand name on anything. And what people are buying is the kind of values behind it. And I think that because they're a company that has started relatively recently, since these kind of trends have emerged in the past decade or so, they haven't necessarily had to switch, which is much harder. They've founded themselves on these principles in the first place. And so I think that's a wonderful example of a brand who's really going in this direction.
Great. And I think we've got some time for some questions. If I'm just going to open it up to the audience in case anyone has any questions for Gianna at this point. Just raise your hand if you do. Otherwise, I'll continue with another question. Okay, I think we've got one at the back.
Do you get any sense that youngsters in particular are sort of less interested in status symbols because they don't think they'll ever get to them? So, life's getting a bit harder for the younger generation. Do they have lower aspirations, so that's why they would look at sharing rather than wanting things that others wanted?
Yeah, so when I say a lot of these trends started in the past decade or so, it mostly started post-2008 recession. So this is why, in particular, sharing economy platforms like Uber or Airbnb, for example, really took off from 2010 onwards. And a lot of this has come in the wake of kind of the unavailability of being able to own a penthouse in a place like London or New York anymore. But having said that, I think that there's a principle of flexibility that underlies a lot of this that goes beyond just simply, well, it's not possible to accrue anything via ownership anymore. And this is why, so if we look at something like co-working, for example, people wanting to work in spaces like WeWork instead of going to their consulting office every day, it's because they see the value in engaging in more flexible work, in interacting with people and ideas that they wouldn't necessarily get in their kind of solid job of just going to the same office from 9 to 5 every day. And so I think these kind of principles of flexibility that have shifted, lots of other things like the way we work, not just the way we consume, are there in tandem with the economic realities for a lot of people, which have been around really since 2008, but have also been exacerbated more recently as well.
Thanks for the question, John. Did that satisfy you, that answer?
Yeah, that's fine, thank you.
Any other questions? I think Omar at the front has a question. Just the editors of MediaTel for now.
Hi. That was very interesting. I can't help, I know this is kind of getting more and more niche, but I can't help thinking about NFTs in this context. So in terms of social status, it seems like what we're seeing so far from NFTs is like a hyper version of what you're talking about, and people constantly wanting to show, in some cases, how rich they are, but in other cases, how up on things they are. And it reminds me of how people would buy art, which is almost a kind of way of showing the world how rich they are, or kind of how cultured they are. Do you think kind of what we're seeing with the evolution of NFTs means it's going to be a more aggressive or hyper version of kind of all the things you've been talking about?
I think that's a great example. I guess the simple answer I would say is yes. I think that in the NFT space, I mean, while it is a possession and you do own it, in many ways it's more similar to an experience than to actual ownership. And because it's dematerialized, it's not, NFTs aren't material objects that you own. And this has been part of the shift as well, away from ownership of material objects towards experiences. And I think NFTs exactly embodies that space where, you can kind of post about it. One thing that I haven't had a chance to mention yet, since we're having a brief conversation, is the importance of attention capital. So in accruing social status in the past, we would always think about kind of cultural capital, which oftentimes came along with social class. Now it's more about attention capital and how much attention you can garner in online spaces, which is pretty disconnected from one's social class background, for example. And NFTs exactly help people facilitate that accrual of attention capital because they are kind of digital things that you can post about, and they exist in this experience space. So that's a very long answer to say, yes, I agree with you. I do think that NFTs are kind of the hyper version of exactly this trend.
I think something we also haven't touched on, and like we just, as you mentioned just now, was social media and playing into this. And that one example you give in your paper is that you can post a picture of yourself online in front of a jet, and so you have that association, even though you're not the owner of the jet, you might never have even flown on the jet, but you still have that status just because you posted that picture. If you want to elaborate any more on that.
Yeah, exactly. So I think this goes back to the point we were talking about earlier in terms of it's difficult to interpret signals. So it's what you'll often see on social media is that people who are extraordinarily wealthy play that down in terms of what they post. But then people who aren't necessarily they may be renting a private jet for the day with their friends, or but they'll use that as kind of a background to gain that attention capital within these spaces. And that attention capital can oftentimes be parlayed into economic capital, right? Because if we think about influencers, for example, how do they get paid and how do they get hired by brands based on how many followers they have? So that can really be parlayed into economic capital. And so, using all of these types of signals, even if they're not owned, ends up being important in that space.
Any other questions from the audience? Anyone?
I think there's one here.
There's one here at the front. Oh, just got a mic for you.
Thank you. I was just wondering about environmental, like products needing to be respectful, not just about the artisan. If consumers, is that driving a big force as well?
That's a great question. So a lot of my research has looked at exactly this issue about ethical consumption, and not only my research, but a lot of research has shown that in the end, there is actually not a high correlation between the values and beliefs that consumers have and really believe passionately in and their actual consumption behavior. This is starting to shift a little bit, and in particular with younger generations. But from a branding perspective, I think, well, what I have seen that has worked kind of the best, if you will, is a conceptualization, and I love the name of this, which is alternative hedonism. Oftentimes the messages you see as to why people should be buying something that's more sustainable or better for the earth is because it's the right thing to do. And being the right thing to do is never very motivating to consumers. I liked our speaker earlier who was talking about the ice cream brand that he founded, and he said at the beginning he talked about how healthy it was, and then it was like, no, people want indulgence from ice cream, and consumers, and so talking about the kind of hedonistic benefits or kind of the status benefits that you can get from purchasing those particular brands tends to be what really works in this space and what does convey that type of status.
Okay, great. I think we are just about to run out of time, but just one last thing. What for one key takeaway for any brands and advertising people here, what's the one key thing that they need to remember about social status?
I think the age of conspicuousness is over. This age of kind of displaying, the huge Mercedes logo on your car or the huge LV logo on your bag or anything like this, those days are gone.
Okay. And on that bombshell, I think we're going to finish up this panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you.